know on the agenda it says that I'm going to be talking about genotyping, and I am going to be talking about genotyping, but I kind of given you the bird's eye view of big overview of the National Scrapie Eradication Program, because the genotyping kind of fits into the whole bigger piece. So why do we even have a Scrapie Eradication Program? So one reason is because it costs sheep producers $10 to $20 million annually. A study that C had done quite some time ago. We expect that the goat producers are affected proportionally as well. What Scrapie does is in a susceptible flock with a lot of susceptible animals, the lifespan of the ewes gets shorter and shorter. So it's an insidious disease. It's not going to be a big economic drain that they can see right away, but it does bleed away at the productivity of flocks and herds. Also, there's reduced export opportunities if Scrapie is in this country. So breeding stock, semen, embryos, etc. And even though Scrapie isn't a human health risk, known to be a human health risk, I have to say that right, it's a good idea to get prions off the face of the earth because they don't always follow the rules and you know, they could potentially get into other species. And there's lots of research saying that that's, you know, we're always seeing cross Scrapie being experimentally transmitted to other species. So just get rid of it. So we have the National Scrapie Eradication Program, and in a nutshell, in 2 words or few words, is its purpose is to eradicate Scrapie. So we're going to do that in classical Scrapie. We're not doing the atypical, the NOR98 Scrapie anymore because we don't believe it to be transmissible as the classical Scrapie is. And eradicate in the United States and then document that eradication. So we can apply for disease-free status through OIE and open up the export markets. So the components of the Scrapie Eradication Program is, you know, we look for disease and we find disease and we trace disease back to the flocks of origin and where they might have sent exposed animals. So tracing positive and exposed animals, however we find them. Then we clean those flocks up once we've traced them back. So get rid of the disease in those flocks and watch them to see if they break again. Surveillance, so that's, you know, we have to find the disease before we can trace it back. Identification, well, if we find disease, how do we trace it back? Primarily through the identification the mandatory identification program that we have. And then education. And the Scrapie flock certification program. We'll have maybe 1 slide on that. Okay, so surveillance, we've tested last year over 43,000 animals, exceeded our annual goal. Most of those samples were through slaughter surveillance. We have slaughter surveillance in mature ewes. So you can't find Scrapie in even though younger animals can be exposed and are infected with Scrapie, we can't diagnose it widely and easily in the younger animals until they're about 18 months of age. So we target our surveillance at the mature animals and slaughter plants. We do get on-farm samples as well, and that's where you might get questions, or you can be an advocate for us as you're meeting with these goat producers, is to educate them about clinical signs of Scrapie and to give them a person to call if they see those signs of Scrapie, or to even if they want to voluntarily do some testing for Scrapie, you can work with your designated Scrapie epidemiologist. We have one for every state. Some of them are here. Can you raise your hands if you're a DSE? So if you know who your DSE is, great. If you don't, you can contact me or Chuck Gazer in districts 1 and 2. And if you don't have his contact information, you can just contact me and I'll get you going where you need to go. So we can have some discussions on surveillance on these on-farm animals, doing some live animal testing, especially in states that aren't meeting their sampling minimums. So most of our samples are from sheep, and about 10,000, well, not little over 9,000 were from goats last year. So slaughter surveillance, we started that in April 1st, 2003. We collected over 600,000 animals since that time. And we've identified 472 cases of classical scrapie in 470 sheep and in 2 goats through just surveillance. So those are just the positives found at slaughter. That doesn't count the animals that were found when we traced back and depopulated those flocks and tested those animals. So really 470 flocks, probably. Usually it's just a singleton we find, a positive from a given flock. So on-farm surveillance, we usually get those with people reporting suspects. Scrapie is a reportable disease in all states. It has to be for the states to be considered a consistent state for scrapie purposes. 9 CFR, and all our states are considered scrapie consistent. We also have animals that are brought to diagnostic laboratories, tested for something else usually, and get submitted when they can't find the cause of death, or sometimes they do find the cause of death and they'll submit a sample for scrapie. We love those because they're they're much more likely to be scrapie positive than a random animal at slaughter. Animals negative for rabies at public health labs. Mature sheep and goats that die on the farm or just die of unknown cause, because that is actually one of the clinical signs of scrapie. Sometimes they don't go through the whole itchy neurological progression, they just die. Kind of depends on what their condition is. We do live animal testing of higher risk animals. So usually in states that aren't meeting their minimums, but if there are some management things that producers are doing that you think they would make them a good candidate for making them higher risk for getting scrapie, we're certainly willing to talk about it. So talk to Checker Eye, and we'd be happy to discuss doing live animal testing if you come across that. And on average, we test about 2,000 live animal or on-farm surveillance samples per year. Some of those come from the Scrapie certification program flocks as well, because they have mandatory testing of any found dead mature animal. So passive surveillance, again, I said it's a reportable disease. We want to consider it in animals 12 months of age or older with one or more of the following signs. So I'm a lumper, so I lumped all the neurological signs into one bullet. But what you're looking for there is bilateral. Bilateral is a pretty key word with most of these clinical signs. Bilateral gait abnormalities. They might be bunny hopping. They might be high stepping. Make sure I don't forget any. Swaying in the hind end. Other neurological signs can be, they might have tremors. They might stargaze. They might be pressing their heads. But the gait abnormalities will be bilateral. Weakness and progressing to death or sudden death can be a sign of scrapie. Significant weight loss, even in the face of having a good appetite. So chronic wasters, right? Because it's kind of like CWD. So the scrapie gets its name from repeating intense rubbing or scraping their bodies, and this will be bilateral. So they'll scrape their wool off, or they'll have damaged wool on similar locations on both sides of the animal, or if on the head, both sides of the poll. They like to scratch their heads. And going along with that intense rubbing, the skin will get abraded and rough. So you look for the same kind of signs in the same areas that look like they've been scraping their wool off. You look on their skin, see if the skin's rough and thickened. So again, these are, Scrapie is a reportable disease, and those are the clinical signs we're looking for. So that's a Scrapie infected Boer goat. You can obviously see the neurological abnormalities there. These are goats that are infected with Scrapie, but really, if there are clinical signs, I can't see them. They're pretty subtle. And then this is a early presentation with some clinical signs. You can kind of see this legs crossing, front legs crossing. Little problem getting up, not moving quite right. That's pretty subtle, in my opinion. And it's just repeating. Okay, so we talked about surveillance. Now we can talk about animal identification. So there's mandatory identification. Everybody's got to participate in the identification of sheep and goats for movement purposes. So if they're just hanging out on the farm, they spend their whole life on the farm, they don't necessarily have to be ID'd. But why we identify the sheep and goats is pretty obvious. We want to be able to trace them back or trace them forward. So we assign flock IDs to producers or serial tags to producers. We track them in a database. We can find out who had them. You know, if it's a market, we can go to the market and find out who the market put them in. Or if it's a flock ID, we should be able to get right to that producer and find out where that animal came from. Easy peasy. So tracing forward or tracing back from a positive at slaughter is the most common scenario. Once we find that infected flock, we'll want to know when that animal was born, and if it was a female, when she lambed, and we'll know who the exposed animals were. We won't have to go back in time and then trace those animals out to where they sold them. So along with mandatory ID, there is record keeping that everybody is supposed to be doing. But what are some other reasons why, as a regulatory agency, we would want to have ID in animals other than tracing disease? Anybody? Mark, anybody?
It's really good management practice.
It's a good management practice. So it's good for inventory. So, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily be a Scrapie official ID, but unique ID within your herd when it's beyond, 5 animals. Will help you know who you treated, and it helps with your record keeping. It also helps us if they're in the Scrapie flock certification program. We're really picky about knowing what animals were there last year and what animals you have here now, and knowing which animals were added in and where they came from. So you can't do that with anything but having them be officially identified, uniquely identified. Another reason is for official tests. So we do official tests, and we do official genotype tests, which isn't necessarily a test for disease, right? But if we're doing any kind of test on an animal, it is preferred and often mandatory. But in the context of goat NAHMS, when you're doing testing on these animals, we'd really, really like those animals to have an official ID in them if possible. I suggest carrying some serial tags and an applicator with you, and really encouraging the producers to identify the animals before you test them, to have that unique ID. Okay, we have recently changed our goat ID, or our sheep and goat ID rules. Goats are more like sheep used to be. This is a really complex flow chart, and I'm not going to go over it now. But what I want you to remember, what's new, and goat producers might know this, hear about this, what has changed. So what's changed is the low-risk commercial goats used to be exempt. The state could exempt them from ID requirements. So mostly your meat and fiber goats that weren't in contact with sheep didn't necessarily have to have an ID for movement purposes. That's changed. We're treating them more like the sheep are. So in most cases, mature goats and intact goats that aren't going to slaughter will need official identification to move. So official identification is usually tags, and there's all different kinds of tags. There's metal tags and plastic tags and APHIS provided tags and tags they can buy that are official. And in addition to those, tattoos, you heard about that earlier. For registered animals, the registration tattoo can be considered official ID under certain movements, and also APHIS approved electronic ID devices or implants are also, that is an option. If they ask for, I don't want to put a tag in my animal's ear, those are some options that can be discussed. But it's important to remember that tattoos used to be okay as official ID to move through a market or to go to slaughter, and they're not anymore. You need a visible ID. So those are 3 points that I'd like you to remember about the new sheep and goat ID rule that pertains to goats. Okay, so here's animal ID. We will supply up to 80 free plastic tags until the money runs out, to new producers only, producers who have never gotten tags from us before. So that's an option. We still are giving out 100 metal tags to producers who haven't ordered in, 48 months? Mark? 24 months, 2 years. So.
Is the money close to running out? September 1st?
Yeah, August 30th, yeah, September 1st, we're not gonna be giving the plastic tags anymore. So there's the 866 USDA tag number to have producers call and inquire about tags and tag requirements. What I want to point out on this tag at the bottom, what should you look for on a tag to know that if it's an official tag or not? The shield. So there's the shield.
This may be getting off in the weeds, but how can an implant be considered official? I was always told they had to run with their own reader, but eventually it's going to be a meat animal, and that chip is going to be, or that implant.
Yeah, we've got we want them to be tattooed with either in the ear or their tail web where the implant is. So yeah, they're gonna have to put in a visual ID. They're gonna have to put in a tag at some point too, right? Okay, so eradication program, we talked about tracing positive and exposed animals back to the flock of origin, and our mandatory ID requirements have been really good. We've had really good success. 85% of the animals that test positive we're able to trace back. And that's overall since 2003. Of course, that's gotten better and better as time has gone on. Okay, so once we find an infected flock, we have put them on a flock plan, which involves officially making sure that they've identified all their sheep and goats, even if they're not moving off the farm, making sure they're keeping records like they're supposed to be keeping records of animals that come onto the farm, animals that are leaving the farm. They're supposed to keep those for 5 years after they no longer own the animal, or 5 years after the animal dies. The most common flock plan for the sheep is a genotyping flock plan where we genotype all the animals. We remove the genetically susceptible ones, the ones that are 171 QQ in most cases. Flock plan allows for us to dig through their records to see where they sold animals, that might have been exposed. It's all in the flock plan, and then there's a cleaning and disinfection portion of that flock plan that has to be completed before they get their indemnity money. So we talked about a genetic-based flock plan for the sheep, but we don't have one for the goats because there hasn't been, until recently, clear to know which genes and which alleles and which codons to be testing for that possibly could give resistance to the sheep and goats. But Stephen White, and I've stolen these next three or four goat slides this is all his work, it's all his slides. I just thought he said it better. He's finding that goat alleles having an S at codon 146 and having a K at codon 222 of the prion gene, that's the PRNP. Every animal, every prion is a normal protein in animals. So this is the prion gene where we find these codons. And he's finding in his study that having an S at 140, one copy of S at 146, or even one at K222, appears to be giving these animals resistance. So there they are. There's 146. You can either have an N or an S, coding for amino acids there. So the N is, what is the N? The N is arginine and the S is serine. It's the amino acids that are coded for at codon 146. And then at K220, at the 222 can either be the K, the lysine, or the Q, which is for glutamine. So S at 146, K at 222 is what he wanted to test. So he looked at these two alleles, at codon 146, the serine. It's common in the US, less common in Europe, and kind of flip-flopped for the K220, having K at 222. It's more common in Europe and less common in the US. So we'd really like to, that's part of this goat NAHMS, would be to better characterize what codons are in the US population. So his study design, Stephen White's study design, he orally challenged 5 controls and then 8 kids with having S at 146 and 8 kids having K at 222. And then the controls had neither of those, no S at 146 and no K at 222. And this is what he's found so far. The control animals, there were 5 of them. 4 of them were rectal biopsy positive, live animal test positive, and all 5 of them had clinical signs of Scrapie. Their average lifespan was 2.2 years. Having the S at 146, those animals lived an average of 7.5 years. He's got 5 of the 8 of those still alive, no clinical signs, no rectal biopsy positive. Pretty clear, right? And at K222, similar results. Those animals are averaging time, that should be a 6.7 years. No positives, no clinical signs, and 2 of the 8 were still alive.
This is, are these the same 8? Do they have a S and a K, or is some have S and some have K?
They're different animals.
Okay.
They're a different group of animals.
So it appears to be protective if they got an S or a K.
Correct.
And one other question, and I know you don't get into this probably, is this, does he suspect these animals are infectious, contagious?
That's a good question. I'll have to ask him.
That could be a real problem if we get a subclinical contagious animal that may reverse the progress of our program.
To date, I don't think that they found that it lowered the shedding. I think the research that they had till now showed the prolonged lifespan, but it didn't show anything yet about the shedding.
So I know if he necropsy is someone that dies, so if there's any prion in them, he'll find it. So if there's none, then there's none. Maybe it just doesn't go out to the peripheral tissue, but he hasn't reported anything on necropsy.
Be interesting to see what comes out of all this over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the problem with the prion diseases. It takes so long to really make any big conclusions about things. Okay, so that was the sidebar onto the goat genotyping, which is really important for you guys. Moving back to the flock cleanup plan. So you've done a flock cleanup plan, you've gotten rid of your susceptible animals, you've done C&D as best you can. Then we put flocks on a 5-year post-exposure monitoring and management plan, which entails, ID and record keeping. They supposed to get visited once a year, at least called. They're supposed to report any clinical signs of Scrapie, have us come out and sample if needed. Maintain their records like they're supposed to be. And sometimes there's restricted animals on a post-exposure monitoring and management plan, but not so much with our straightforward QQ Scrapie, remove the QQs, have a nice day. The QRs and RRs are generally able to move. And in sheep genetic-based flock plans, of course, in our standard flock plan for goats is they're all susceptible, so they all get euthanized. But in light of this new research, we're willing to look at some pilot projects to see how it's going to work with the S and the K at 146 and 222. Okay, our Scrapie-free flock certification program. This is separate from the mandatory Scrapie program. This one's completely voluntary. It's really intense. It's for producers. There's 2 different flavors of it. One is the export category, where people monitor their animals for 7 years, have annual inspections. Not supposed to either keep a closed flock, or if they don't keep a closed flock, animals that come in have to be at an equal or higher status, otherwise they'll lose status. So the goal is to have a 7-year status date. We do have some sampling requirements. There's several different, at least 3 different options on the how many you're supposed to sample. But if you have a big enough flock, we'd really like you to get 30 samples and 7 years of status before you move up to be export certified, and then Canada does accept our export certified status. Other countries, we've been trying to do some things with Taiwan and another country, I can't remember, to compare what our certification program is compared to what they would like to see. Of course, it's always apples and oranges, and it's like, well, yeah, we kind of do that, or we don't do that, or we do that in spades. So at least we have some standard of how we monitor these flocks. There's also the select category. You don't gain time and status. You don't get it. The flocks don't get to move up to export status, export certified status. It's just for flocks to say that they are monitoring. There are some testing requirements, very minimal, depending on their flock size. So they just.
Nationally, how many flocks do you have in those now?
I think I got a slide coming up on that in our status, so we'll get to that. Okay. So where are we at in the eradication program? Very, very few cases found every year. We did find one last month in Michigan in a goat in a Michigan slaughter plant. Looks like it's going to be Indiana, still ongoing. So we're still finding cases, but not very many. Classical Scrapie. So you can kind of look at this chart, see your classic epi curve. You can kind of see where we started the accelerated eradication program in 2001 and slaughter surveillance in 2003, and then in 2009 we had state minimums for states to have surveillance numbers for both sheep and goats. Okay, what are we collecting at slaughter? It's mostly sheep because our surveillance minimums are sheep heavy. In about the same proportion. Looks like we're doing more goats on farm in FY18 than sheep. But we're doing 41,418 animals total at slaughter, and just a small number, much smaller number on farm. Cases, sheep samples tested positive for classical Scrapie, weighted by face color, because we have just this is kind of our approximation at prevalence in the US. We don't sample all the white faces that come through, or historically we haven't. We've cut off the older animals because we figure if they've lived that long, they probably don't have Scrapie. So just as a cost saving measure. So there's some math in the background to adjust for that. But prevalence is super duper low. Okay, goat cases in the US. We had a really big outbreak in California in some grazing goats. So that 13 bumped it way up. Colorado's had some, Arizona's probably pretty recent. So the green and the blue ones are the more recent cases. So we're gonna have a new one, probably Indiana's gonna be blue as well.
How many cases were not related to commingling with sheep of those?
It's hard to know.
Because one of the few cases, I think some of ours are speaking about their.
So that affects they had some, whether they historically could call their goats low-risk commercial goats. So we did find something way back in California. I mean, these goats were all kept separate, but where they all came from, if you start looking back, there was a sheep associated with that one, but it was specious, and California already required mandatory ID of all their goats anyway, so we didn't push it too much. Colorado, I think they did lose their low-risk commercial status, so we must not have been able to have a good link. I know Washington was the same way. I'm sorry, it's the red that's the more recent cases. Okay, move on. So we do find Scrapie in goats is the point. And here are our SFCP participating flocks, Kim. Not by state as a whole, but you know, we really started getting tough about requirements and assessing penalties to flocks that didn't play by the rules in like 2015, 2016. So we have had some drop off. And that's fine. This is really the primary purpose of the certification program, is for those flocks who want to export. And it's 7 years. It takes some time, and you're going to see us every year, and it's a pain. So if they want to do it, we're here to provide that service for them and to help them to meet that good housekeeping seal of approval if that's what they want. But there's no expectation in your state that you have so many flocks in the SFCP. So it's just another service we provide. But it's not a measuring point like meeting your state minimums. We're looking at that. You got to do that. This is extra. Okay, I guess I do have a slide on SFCP by state. So North Dakota and Nevada don't have any. Some states have more than others. Kind of surprised that it's a lot of the states that border with Canada will often join more. I don't know what's up with North Dakota. They just must not have the breeding stock that they want to export. Okay, so when will we achieve freedom? Well, we keep finding cases, so we can't start counting down our years of free time. So, yeah, we're at the point where we may or may not find new cases each year. Well, we found a goat case, so we know that it's not going to be this year. So we're hoping by the mid 2030s that we'll have the 7 years of high surveillance where we're really, you got to look for it. Can't just say we don't have Scrapie. You got to really be looking for it. And it's boring to and I know it's discouraging to continue to sample animals and negative, but we really need that data to show that we've really looked for Scrapie and haven't been finding it or not finding very much of it, as the case is now. Once we achieve that free status, we'll cut back on the sampling recommendations to the OIE recommendations of 3,000 sheep and 3,000 goats annually. Any questions?
Thanks so much.
Okay,
Diana.
thanks.
That was very good.